You're listening to True Voice Shorts from True Voice Productions, where we empower your story with voice. Each episode brings you a story of insight, wonder, or truth, delivered in 30 minutes or less. Welcome to Gentle Magic, a series of timeless tales where wonder weaves quietly through the ordinary, and magic works in subtle, unexpected ways. Today's story is an adaptation of The Light Princess by George MacDonald. George MacDonald was a Scottish author, poet, and minister, a quiet pioneer of the literary fairy tale. Writing in the 19th century, he helped shape the genre we now know as modern fantasy, inspiring authors like C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Madeleine L'Engle. MacDonald's stories often blend whimsy with wisdom, offering not only escape into magic, but glimpses of deeper truths. He believes that fairy tales weren't just for children, they were for anyone willing to see the world with wonder. The Light Princess is one of his most beloved tales. First published in 1864, it tells a story of a princess cursed to lose her gravity. Not just her physical weight, but her emotional grounding. Lighthearted to a fault, she floats through life, unable to feel sorrow, love, or even seriousness. It's a whimsical fable about learning to find balance, about the grounding power of love and sacrifice. MacDonald's gentle storytelling and quiet magic remind us that the best fairy tales aren't only about wizards or witches. Sometimes they're about laughter, loss, and the slow, steady pull of the heart. The Light Princess. A wish for a child. Once upon a time, so long ago that I've quite forgotten the date, there lived a king and queen who had no children. And the king said to himself, "All of the queens of my acquaintance have children, some 3, some 7, and some as many as 12. And my queen has not one. I feel ill-used." So he made up his mind to be cross with his wife about it. But she bore it like a good, patient queen as she was. Then the king grew very cross indeed, but the queen pretended to take it all as a joke, and a very good one too. "Why don't you have any daughters at least?" he said. "I don't say sons, that might be too much to expect." "I'm sure, dear king, I am very sorry," said the queen. "So you ought to be," retorted the king. "You are not going to make a virtue of that, surely." But he was not an ill-tempered king, and in any matter of less moment would have let the queen have her own way with all his heart. This, however, was an issue of state. The queen smiled. "You must have patience with a lady you know, my dear king," she said. She was indeed a very nice queen, and heartily sorry that she could not oblige the king immediately. The king tried to have patience, but he succeeded very badly. It was more than he deserved, therefore, when at last the queen gave him a daughter, as lovely a princess as ever cried. The day grew near when the infant must be christened. The king wrote all the invitations with his own hand. Of course, somebody was forgotten. Now, it does not generally matter if somebody is forgotten, only you must mind who. Unfortunately, the king forgot without intending to forget, so the chance fell upon Princess Macamnot, which was awkward, for the princess was the king's own sister, and he ought not to have forgotten her. But she made herself so disagreeable to the old king, their father, that he had forgotten her in making his will. And so it was no wonder that her brother forgot her in writing his invitations. But poor relations don't do anything to keep you in mind of them. Why don't they? The king could not see into the garret she lived in, could he? She was a sour, spiteful creature. The wrinkles of contempt crossed the wrinkles of peevishness and made her face as full of wrinkles as a pat of butter. If ever a king could be justified in forgetting anybody, this king was justified in forgetting his sister, even at a christening. She looked very odd, too. Her forehead was as large as the rest of her face and projected over it like a precipice. When she was angry, her little eyes flashed blue. When she hated anybody, they shone yellow and green. What she looked like when she loved anybody, I do not know, for I never heard of her loving anybody but herself, and I do not think she could have managed that if not she had somehow gotten used to herself. What made it highly imprudent in the king to forget her was that she was awfully clever. In fact, she was a witch. And when she bewitched anybody, he very soon had enough of it, for she beat all the wicked fairies in wickedness and all the clever ones in cleverness. A blessing and a curse. She despised all the modes we read of in history in which the offended fairies and witches have taken their revenge. And therefore, after waiting and waiting in vain for an invitation, she made up her mind to at last to go without one, and make the whole family miserable, like the princess she was. So she put on her best gown, went to the palace, and was kindly received by the happy monarch, who forgot that he had forgotten her, and she took her place in the procession to the royal chapel. When they all were gathered about the font, she contrived to get next to it and throw something into the water, after which she remained very respectful, demure, till the water had been applied to the child's face. At that moment, she turned around in her place 3 times and muttered the following words, loud enough for those beside her to hear. "Light of spirit by my charms, light of body every part. Never weary human arms, only crush thy parents' heart." They all thought she'd lost her wits and was repeating some foolish nursery rhyme. But a shudder went through the whole of them notwithstanding. The baby, on the contrary, began to laugh and crow, while the nurse gave a start and smothered cry, for she thought she was struck with paralysis. She could not feel the baby in her arms. But she clasped it tight and said nothing. The mischief was done. Her atrocious aunt had deprived the child of all her gravity. If you ask me how this was effected, I'd answer, in the easiest way in the world. She had only to destroy gravitation, for the princess was a philosopher and knew all the ins and outs of the laws of gravitation, as well as the ins and outs of her bootlace. And being a witch as well, she could abrogate those laws in a moment, or at least so clog their wheels and rust their bearings that they would not work at all. But we have more to do with what followed than how it was done. The first awkwardness that resulted from this unhappy privation was that the moment the nurse began to float the baby up and down, she flew from her arms towards the ceiling. Happily, the resistance of the air brought her ascended career to a close within a foot of it. There she remained, horizontal as when she left her nurse's arms, kicking and laughing amazingly. The nurse, in terror, flew to the bell and begged the footman who answered it to bring her up the house steps directly. Trembling in every limb, she climbed upon the steps and had to stand on the very top and reach up before she could catch the floating tail of the baby's long clothes. When the strange fact came to be known, there was a terrible commotion in the palace. The occasion of its discovery by the king was naturally a repetition of the nurse's experience. Astonished that he felt no weight when the child was laid in his arms, he began to wave her up and not down, for she slowly ascended to the ceiling as before, and there remained floating in perfect comfort and satisfaction, as was testified by the peals of her tiny laughter. The king stood staring up in speechless amazement and trembled so that his beard shook like grass in the wind. At last, turning to the queen, who was just as horror-struck as himself, he said, gasping, staring, and stammering, She can't be ours, queen." Now the queen was much cleverer than the king and began already to suspect the cause. I am sure she is ours, answered the queen. But we ought to have taken better care of her at the christening. People who were never invited ought not to have been present. Ho, ho, said the king, tapping his forehead with his forefinger. I have it. I found her out. Don't you see it, Queen? Princess Marmonoid has bewitched her. That's just what I say, answered the queen. I beg your pardon, my love. I did not hear you. John, bring the steps I get on my throne with. For he was a little king with a great throne, like many other kings. The throne steps were brought and set upon the dining table, and John climbed upon the top step of them. But he could not reach the princess, who lay like a baby laughter cloud in the air, exploding continuously. Take the prongs, John, said His Majesty, and getting up on the table, he handed them to him. John could reach the baby now, and the little princess was handed down by the tongs. One fine summer day, a month after these first adventures, during which time she had been very carefully watched, the princess was laying on the bed in the queen's own chamber, fast asleep. One of the windows was open, for it was noon, and the day was so sultry that the little girl was wrapped in nothing less ethereal than slumber itself. The queen came into the room, and not observing that the baby was on the bed, opened another window. A frolicsome fairy wind, which had been watching for a chance at mischief, rushed in at one window, and taking its way over the bed where the child was lying, caught her up, and rolling and floating her along like a piece of flue or a dandelion seed, it carried her with it through the opposite window and away. The queen went downstairs, quite ignorant of the loss she had herself occasioned. When the nurse returned, she supposed that Her Majesty had carried her off, and, dreading a scolding, delayed making inquiry about her. But hearing nothing, she grew uneasy, and went at length to the Queen's bedroom, where she found Her Majesty. "Please, Your Majesty, shall I take the baby?" she said. "Where is she?" asked the Queen. "Please forgive me. I know it was wrong." "What do you mean?" said the Queen, looking grave. "Oh, don't frighten me, Your Majesty," exclaimed the nurse, clasping her hands. The queen saw that something was amiss and fell down in a faint. The nurse rushed about the palace, screaming, "My baby, my baby!" Everyone ran to the queen's room, but the queen could give no orders. They soon found out, however, that the princess was missing, and in a moment the palace was like a beehive in a garden. And in 1 minute more, the queen was brought to herself by a great shout and a clapping of hands. They found the princess fast asleep under a rose bush, to which the elvish little wind puff had carried her, finishing its mischief by shaking a shower of red rose leaves all over the little white sleeper. Startled by the noise the servants made, she awoke, and furious with glee, scattered the rose leaves in all directions, like a shower of spray in the sunset. She was watched more carefully after this, no doubt. Yet it would be endless to relate all the odd incidents that occurred with this young princess. But there was never a baby in a house, not to say a palace, that kept the household in such constant good humor, at least below stairs. If it was not easy for her nurses to hold her, at least she made neither their arms nor their hearts ache, and she was so nice to play ball with. There was positively no danger of letting her fall. They might throw her down, or knock her down, or push her down, but couldn't let her down. It is true, they might let her fly into the fire, or the coal hole, or through the window, but none of these incidents had happened as yet. If you heard the peals of laughter resounding from some unknown region, you might be sure enough of the cause. Going down into the kitchen or the room, you would find Jane and Thomas and Robert and Susan, and all and some, playing at ball with the little princess. She was the ball herself, and did not enjoy it the less for it. Away she went, flying from one to another, screeching with laughter. And the servants loved the ball itself even better than the game. But they had to take some care how they threw her, for if she received an upward direction, she would never come down again without being fetched. What is it to be done? One day, for instance, after breakfast, the king went to his counting house and counted out his money. The operation gave him no pleasure. To think, he said to himself, that every one of these gold sovereigns weighs 1/4 of an ounce, and my real, live, flesh and blood princess weighs nothing at all. And he hated his gold sovereigns as they lay with a broad smile of self-satisfaction all over their yellow faces. The queen was in the parlor eating bread and honey, but at the last mouthful, she burst out crying and could not swallow it. The king, hearing her sobbing, glad of anybody, but especially of his queen, to quarrel with, he clashed his gold sovereigns into the money box and clamped his crown on his head and rushed to the parlor. "What is all this about?" he exclaimed. "What are you crying for, queen?" "I can't eat it," said the queen, looking ruefully at the honey pot. "No wonder," retorted the king. "You've just eaten your breakfast. 2 turkey eggs and 3 anchovies." "Oh, that's not it," sobbed Her Majesty. "It's my child, my child." "Well, what's the matter with your child? She's neither up the chimney nor down the draw-well. Just hear her laughing." Yet the king could not help a sigh, which he turned into a cough, saying, "It is a good thing to be light-hearted, I'm sure, whether she be ours or not." "It is a bad thing to be light-hearted," answered the queen, looking with prophetic soul far into the future. "'Tis a good thing to be light-handed," said the king. "'Tis a bad thing to be light-fingered," answered the queen. "'Tis a good thing to be light-footed," said the king. "'Tis a bad thing," began the queen, but the king interrupted her. "In fact," he said with the tone of one who concludes an argument in which he has had only imaginary opponents, and in which, therefore, he had come off triumphant. "In fact, it is a good thing altogether to be light-bodied." "But it is a bad thing altogether to be light-minded," retorted the queen, who was beginning to lose her temper. This last answer quite discomforted His Majesty, who turned on his heel and betook himself to his counting-house again. But he was not halfway toward it when the voice of the queen overtook him. "And it is a bad thing to be light-haired," screamed she, determined to have the last words now that her spirit was roused. The queen's hair was black as night, and the king's had been, and his daughter's was as golden as morning. But it was not this reflection on his hair that arrested him. It was the double use of the word light. For the king hated all witticisms, and punning especially. And besides, he could not tell whether the queen meant light-haired or light-aired. For why not she aspirate her vowels when she was exasperated herself? He turned upon his other heel and rejoined her. She looked angry still, because she knew that she was guilty, or what was much the same, knew that he thought so. "My dear queen," said he, "duplicity of any sort is exceedingly objectionable between married people of any rank, not to say kings and queens. And the most objectionable form duplicity can assume is that of punning." "There," said the queen, "I never made a jest, but I broke it in the making. I am the most unfortunate woman in the world." She looked so rueful that the king took her in his arms and they sat down to consult. "Can you bear this?" said the king. "No, I can't," said the queen. "Well, what is to be done?" said the king. "I'm sure I don't know," said the queen. "But might you not try an apology?" "To my old sister, I suppose you mean?" said the king. "Yes," said the queen. "Ah, well, I don't mind," said the king. So he went the next morning to the house of the princess, and making a very humble apology, begged her to undo the spell. But the princess declared with a grave face that she knew nothing at all about it. Her eyes, however, shone pink, which was a sign that she was happy. She advised the king and queen to have patience and to mend their ways. The king returned disconsolate. The queen tried to comfort him. "We will wait until she's older. She may then be able to suggest something herself. She will know at least how she feels and explain things to us." "But what if she should marry?" exclaimed the king in a sudden consternation at the idea. "Well, what of that?" rejoined the queen. "Just think, if she were to have children, in the course of 100 years, air might be as full of floating children as of gossamers in autumn." "That is no business of ours," replied the queen. "Besides, by that time they will have learned to take care of themselves." A sigh was the king's only answer. He would have consulted the court physicians, but he was afraid they would try experiments on her. "She laughs too much." Meantime, notwithstanding any awkward occurrences and griefs that she brought upon her parents, the little princess laughed and grew, not fat, but plump and tall. She reached the age of 17 without having fallen into any worse scrape than a chimney, by rescuing her from which a little bird-nesting urchin got fame and a black face. Nor, thoughtless as she was, had she committed anything worse than laughter at everybody and everything that came her way. When she was told, for the sake of an experiment, that Clanranfoot was cut to pieces with all his troops, she laughed. When she heard the enemy was on his way to besiege her papa's capital, she laughed hugely. But when she was told that the city would certainly be abandoned to the mercy of the enemy's soldiery, why then she laughed immoderately. She could never be brought to see the serious side of anything. When her mother cried, she said, "What queer faces Mama makes, and she sneezes water out of her cheeks. Funny, Mama." And when her papa stormed at her, she laughed and danced around and round him, clapping her hands and crying, "Do it again, Papa, do it again. It's such fun, dear funny Papa." And if he tried to catch her, she glided away from him in an instant, not in the least afraid of him, but thinking it part of the game not to be caught. With one push of her foot, she could be floating in the air above his head, or she would go dancing backward and forward and sideways like a great butterfly. It happened several times when her father and mother were holding a consultation about her in private that they were interrupted by a vainly repressed outburst of laughter over their heads, and looking up in indignation saw her floating at full length in the air above them, whence she regarded them with the most comical appreciation of the position. One day, an awkward accident happened. The princess had come out upon the lawn with one of her attendants who held her by the hand. Spying her father at the other side of the lawn, she snatched her hand away from the maid's and sped across to him. Now, when she wanted to run alone, her custom was to catch up a stone in each hand so she might come down again after a bound. Whatever she wore as part of her attire had no effect in this way. Even gold, when it thus became as it were a part of her, lost all its weight for the time. But whatever she held in her hands retained its downward tendency. On this occasion, she could see nothing to catch up but a huge toad that was walking across the lawn as it had 100 years to do it. Not knowing what disgust that meant, for this was one of her peculiarities, she snatched up the toad and bounded away. She had almost reached her father, and he was holding out his arms to receive her and take from her lips the kiss which hovered on them like a butterfly on a rosebud, when a puff of wind blew her aside and into the arms of a young page who had just been receiving a message from His Majesty. Now it was no great oddity in the princess that once she was set a-going, it always cost her time and trouble to check herself. On this occasion, there was no time. She must kiss, and she kissed the page. She did not mind it much, for she had no shyness in her composition, and she knew besides that she could not help it, so she only laughed. like a music box. The poor page feared the worst, for the princess, trying to correct the unfortunate tendency of the kiss, put out her hands to keep her off the page, so that along with the kiss he received on the other cheek a slap with the huge black toad, which she poked right into his eye. He tried to laugh, too, but the attempt resulted in an odd contortion of countenance, as showed that there was no danger of his plumbing himself on the kiss. As for the king, his dignity was greatly hurt, and he did not speak to the page for a whole month. I may remark that it is very amusing to see her run, if her mode of progression could properly be called running. For first she would make a bound. Then, having alighted, she would run a few steps and make another bound. Sometimes she would fancy she had reached the ground before she actually had, and her feet would go backwards and forwards, running upon nothing at all, like those of a chicken on its back. Then she would laugh like the very spirit of fun, only in her laugh there was something missing. What it was, I find myself unable to describe. I think it was a certain tone, depending upon the possibility of sorrow. Morbidezza, perhaps. She never smiled. After a long avoidance of the painful subject, the king and queen even tried metaphysics, but nothing worked. Until the day a young prince wandered into the kingdom and found her floating on the lake. A prince, a laugh, and a lake. One summer evening, a prince, traveling incognito, followed the sound of laughter to the palace lake, the one place where the princess could swim without drifting into the sky. Delighted, he joined her in the water, and for the first time she found a companion who treated her lightness as wonder, not oddity. The same week, a drought gripped the realm. Wells ran dry, crops withered, and even the beloved lake began to shrink, its waters escaping through a hidden fissure beneath the rocky bed. If the lake vanished, so too would the princess's only tether to earth, and the kingdom's last hope of rain. Learning of the leak, the prince offered a perilous solution. He would descend at sunset, weighted down by heavy stones, and plug the fissure with his own body until dawn's first light, when masons could seal it with clay and stone. The king and the queen protested. The princess only laughed, until she imagined the lake empty and the prince gone with it. As the moon rose, the prince walked forth from the edge of the water and sank. The lake stilled. Hours crept by. For the first time, the princess felt the ache of fear, a weight heavier than any stone. She paced the shore, floating above the reeds, listening for a ripple, a breath. Silence. The first tear. Just before dawn, a single silver bauble breached the surface and burst. Thinking the prince lost, the princess felt a strange tightness in her chest. A tear, her very first, gathered and trembled and fell. The moment it touched the lake, gravity rushed through her limbs. She sank to her knees on solid ground and wept. Soft human sobs that drew the prince, battered but alive, back to the surface. With the fissure sealed and the drought broken, the rains returned, the lake rose, and the princess walked, not floated, to greet her savior. She still laughed, but now she could also cry, love, and stand firmly beside the prince, grounded in love. In time they married, and the kingdom celebrated a princess who had learned that a light heart needs a little gravity, and that true love sometimes asks us to dive deeper before we can rise together. Some stories leave us with a sense of wonder, others with a quiet reminder of what it means to be human. The Light Princess gives us both, a tale where laughter and love bring us back down to earth. That was The Light Princess, a whimsical story of gravity, grace, and the strange ways love helps us to find our footing. If you enjoyed this gentle touch of magic, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing. There's more quiet wonder to come in gentle magic, and I'll be back soon with another timeless tale.